So for everyone who's been here before, those of you who are new, every month or so, we do a Fairgrounds dialogue, sometimes in the common space, and we've done several down here. What we do in these dialogues is when we're lucky we have a guest, and we're very lucky tonight. We get them to give us some sense of their work, and then there's a question and answer period later. The guest we have today is a good friend and longtime comrade of ours who actually has been to New Orleans with us before. Some years ago, for those of you who recall, when there was an effort under the Morial administration to privatize the sewer and water system. We connected with Wenonah and we got huge help from her in that fight, including a bevy of young women who came and helped us for months, who Beth and I called the Water Girls. They were actually Green Corps organizers assigned to Wenonah. Wenonah pulled strings, or somehow we got them. And one of them still, after all these years, works with Wenonah. Sarah Alexander is the Deputy of Organizing. Wenonah runs, in the current iteration, Food and Water Watch, based in New York, 18 offices, I think you said, around in D.C. What did I say, New York? Oh my God. In D.C. as well as internationally. I know we got her help when we went to Cochabamba and La Paz last year with a group of organizers. So when it comes to water and food, Wenonah has been there, done that, led it, organized it, made it happen, and still continues with this new platform she has, a book she finished writing, I guess it was published last December, so it's very current still, Foodopoly, which she will talk about as well. What she's going to do is both tell about her work, answer questions, and tell about her book. Now about the books. A couple of minutes ago she did a book reading in Octavia uptown. We grabbed her from that and brought her here. Any of you who are interested in buying one of her books, you can talk to us later. Wenonah will sign it. But somehow we have to either sell or count for the books back to Octavia, right? Yeah. So we'll straighten all that out. We'll lock the doors before it's over, and we'll figure out how to, get all this to work. When it comes to the questions and answer periods, I'll recognize everybody. Just say your name as always. But first, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Wenonah, and how glad we are to have her at Fairgrounds and talking about her work.
Well, it's fabulous to be here with Wade and Beth, who are some of the best organizers in the country, and always a pleasure to be here in New Orleans. So I wrote Foodopoly because over the past, 10 years working on food issues, it's become really clear that people are very excited about food. We have a big movement growing, but it kind of stops at the community level. People vote with their fork, they're excited about food for their family and their friends, but the political action hasn't been enough to really bring the changes in our food system that we need. And so I've been really kind of frustrated that it's difficult to talk to people about the structural issues that really need to change if we're going to fix our food system and if we're going to fix our democracy, because the two things kind of go hand in hand. So tonight I'm going to talk about some of those structural issues, and I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about myself. So I grew up on a farm in Virginia. My parents were missionaries, and when I was 11 years old, my dad, who'd grown up during the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, decided that he wanted to get back to the farm, and my parents obviously didn't have a whole lot of money. So we ended up with this really ramshackle farm about 45 miles outside of Washington, D.C. And in those days, D.C. was a sleepy little town. There was no super highway going into the city. And this farm that we ended up on had a mile-long dirt driveway, very rutted. The house no one had lived in for decades. And We never did get plumbing in this house, and it took 2 years to get the electricity. And when my dad would pick me up in the dump truck at high school, I would kind of, cover my face and pretend that I didn't know him. So you can imagine I couldn't wait to get away from this farm where I learned how to pluck chickens and squeeze potato bugs and chop kindling. We always cooked on a cook stove. But even though I was really anxious to get away from that life, really I learned some of the most important lessons. And I learned how hard farmers work and how much time they put into farming and how difficult it is to really produce food, and how most farmers don't make a lot of money. So as I've worked at Food and Water Watch and really heard a lot of food advocates kind of blame farmers for the food system that we have, it's been, kind of a concern of mine. So in Foodopoly, I really try to go back and look at how we ended up with this dysfunctional food system and why we're blaming farmers today rather than the biggest beneficiaries of the food policies that we have. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me tonight because I'm going to go back into some kind of ancient history, because really the beginnings of our food system and what's wrong with it have their root in things that happened, post-World War II. But modern farm policy really began with the Roosevelt administration. You'll remember that in the 1920s, the United States was in a serious depression. For some of the many reasons that we've had a serious economic crisis recently with the financial services industry kind of out of control. Well, rural people were hit probably the hardest. There's a lot of malnutrition, major poverty in rural areas. And one of the things that the Roosevelt administration decided to do when they came into office was to make it possible for farmers to actually make a living, to be paid on par with what urban individuals were able to make. So some of the policies that they began were things like a grain reserve. China's had a grain reserve since about 1837, but grain reserve is where during a good year farmers store their grain in the silo, and then if there's a drought or something, it can be pulled out. And this helps stabilize prices. They did other things like have programs to make sure that there wasn't overproduction, to help make sure that farmers could actually make the cost of production. All very important things if you want to have a workable food system. So this worked pretty well going into the 1940s. You'll remember that the U.S. was really the food basket for the Allies, and that after the war, when Europe was devastated, the U.S. was producing the food that was necessary to stabilize Europe. So a lot of things changed, though, with World War II, including the economic position of the United States. So after the war, the U.S. had become an industrial powerhouse, and the financial center of the world had moved from London to New York. And this had some real repercussions for how food was being produced. There were a number of prominent businessmen who believed that things really needed to change, and that the U.S. needed to have many fewer farmers and food producers, and that actually a lot of those young men coming back from the war and future generations should really be cheap labor for the industrial north and factories. So some of these men got together and started an organization called the Committee for Economic Development. And one of the individuals who helped found this organization, his name was Paul Hoffman, and he went on to be an administrator for the Marshall Plan, to work for the UN Development Program, and eventually to the Ford Foundation to be one of the architects of the Green Revolution. Some of his colleagues that helped form the Committee for Economic Development, there was an individual who was an executive at Kodak Eastman, and another individual who was actually one of the academics who began to figure out how advertising works, how PR works, and how you can persuade consumers to do different things. So these men had an agenda, and their agenda was in large part to have this cheap labor pool, but they also had political reasons for making sure that there were fewer rural people, fewer farmers, because they kind of feared the political power of rural people. Because you will remember that from really the 1880s on, the farm movement was very powerful, and it actually challenged the banks, the railroads, farm organizations, worked with labor, they elected people. There was a lot of political power in these farm organizations. And these men who started the Committee for Economic Development really were concerned about this populist political power and where it could lead in the future, because they really had a different vision of where the direction that the U.S. should go in. So I'm not suggesting that this is some kind of wild conspiracy. This is just men of a certain class who had a lot of resources, who got together to strategize, much as people do, on many issues. So these men were able to attract most of the titans of industry to the Committee for Economic Development, and they began to make some traction. In the first 15 years after this organization was formed, 38 members of the Committee for Economic Development actually held political office. Two of the executives for the Federal Reserve Bank were also members of this Committee for Economic Development, and they were very well placed to begin changing public policy. So during the Eisenhower administration, they began to make traction and to begin to be able to eliminate some of these programs that had actually made farming very attractive. And during the Eisenhower administration, one of the secretaries of agriculture was a man named Ezra Benson, and he was an ideologue. He viewed farm policy from the 1930s as being, driving the country towards communism. You'll remember that in the 1950s, this was the McCarthy era, kind of a communist behind every tree. And so under the Eisenhower administration, they began to change the program so that farmers were not quite making the cost of production. Now, moving into the 1960s, they had made a lot of traction, and in 1962, the CED came out with a report called An Adaptive Plan for Agriculture, and it laid out a lot of their vision for where food production should go in the future. Capital should replace labor. Everything should be directed at efficiency, and their definition of efficiency was vertical integration. You know what vertical integration is, where one company controls the production of a food item from the farm all the way to the grocery store. For instance, Tyson owns the genetics of a chick, the chicks, they own the slaughter facility, and they own the brand in the grocery store. That's kind of the ultimate of vertical integration. So this adaptive plan for agriculture also laid out a number of programs that needed to be changed and things that they wanted to see in the future. They wanted to get rid of programs that directed young men into agriculture in high school and rural areas. They wanted to replace that with incentives to really get these young people trained in technical school and sent to, and moved to urban areas where they could be industrial labor. So the CED followed this report with another report 2 years later on what they called free trade. And this report also had a large percentage of it was focused on agriculture and changing agriculture. And they saw the future in the U.S. providing grains for the world, but most food production moving to where labor is cheaper to the developing world. And when you read this report on trade, many of the recommendations actually came to be public policy in the mid-1990s under the Clinton administration. The investment rules in NAFTA, a lot of the things that the U.S. agreed to under the WTO and trade agreements like NAFTA, and the many trade agreements that have followed. So the CED, when they released these reports, they did it in conjunction with the most prestigious universities in the country with their economics department. And by this time, they had also recruited most of the publishing industry and a lot of the most influential institutions in the U.S. And so this was basically standard policy by this time. So moving into the 1970s, under the Nixon administration, President Nixon appointed one of Ezra Benson's proteges to the Department of Agriculture, and his name was Earl Butz. Now, for those of you who are old enough, you will remember Earl Butz. He was the butt of many jokes, and he was quite a character. And today nobody knows who the Secretary of Agriculture is. You can walk down the street and ask, and it's pretty much an invisible position. But everybody knew who Earl Butz was because he was always putting his foot in his mouth, and he was very political. He was very focused on getting farmers to support Nixon in the next election against McGovern, and many of his policies and the things that he suggested he thought would help elect Nixon. Now, Earl Butz, like his mentor, hated the Roosevelt farm policies and was very anxious to see that farming change. And he told farmers that they need to get big or get out, that they needed to borrow a lot of money and buy land, that there was going to be a huge export market. Now, as it turned out, he traveled around the country and he was able to talk a lot of farmers into borrowing a lot of money, putting their farms up as collateral, and the export market that he promised never materialized. There was 1 year in the 70s that there was an export market for grains, and that's when some of the grain traders made a deal with the Soviet Union when there was a grain failure there. So what happened? A lot of farmers had borrowed a lot of money, and when a farmer has no place to sell their crops and there's overproduction and there's no money to repay the banks, they lose their farms. So in the 1970s and into the 1980s, we lost hundreds of thousands of farms. And it was the beginning of the agricultural crisis that we're still having today. Now, going into the 1980s, there was a lot of pressure to begin deregulating any number of things. And some of the companies that were organizing their money to put President Reagan in office were especially interested in getting rid of the U.S.'s antitrust laws, because from the end of the 1940s through the 50s and 60s and into the 1970s, we had a pretty strong regulatory system that prevented companies from buying their closest competitors. And there was a lot of pressure in the 1970s to begin undoing these laws. And some of the companies that were being investigated were, well, the grocery industry. The grocery industry had begun consolidating, and the Federal Trade Commission was actually looking into this. There were companies like the oil and gas industry that were really interested in being able to consolidate. And actually some of these companies helped raise the money that put President Reagan into office. And one of the first targets was antitrust law. Now, I had the opportunity in writing Foodopoly to interview one of the commissioners at the Federal Trade Commission during this period. He's actually retired in Arizona now. His name is Michael Perchuk. And he told me kind of the sad story about what happened after Reagan's appointee, James Miller, went to the Federal Trade Commission. You know, he did things that you would expect: cut the budget, cut the staff, got rid of whole departments, made things that had been illegal, legal, things like a competitor or a company being able to purchase its closest competitor. And probably most importantly, they narrowed the definition of what an antitrust violation is. And no president since that time has been brave enough to actually have these agencies take another look at this. So after antitrust law was eviscerated, this really opened the floodgates for companies to begin this merger and acquisition frenzy that we've seen up until this day. And it began in the 1980s. And what happens when companies get bigger, when they buy their closest competitors? You end up with just a couple of industries or companies dominating every industry. And that's exactly what we've had happen. And it's not just in the food industry, of course, it's in every industry that you can think of, from the oil industry to rental cars. But it's had a very chilling effect on our food system. Now, as companies get bigger, they gain more political power, right, because they have more wealth. So going into the 1990s, when we had all of these trade negotiations going on, the biggest and most powerful companies in the country were able to really change the debate and to really shape these trade agreements that we became a party to. And this has had a very dramatic effect on food. One of the first things that happened is that in 1996, you'll remember it was during the Clinton administration that the U.S. became a party to the WTO and joined NAFTA. And in 1996, there was a tremendous amount of political pressure to do something about the Farm Bill. Now, the first Farm Bill was that 1933 Farm Bill when the Roosevelt administration had all of those programs to help farmers and rural people. And from 1933 on, about every 5 years, a farm bill would be passed and then money would be appropriated for it. And this is a huge piece of legislation that has many, many titles on commodity policy, on nutrition, so all of the food stamp programs, research, economic development for rural areas, many different policies. But this 1996 bill is when many of the most dramatic changes took place to farm policy, and when that dream that the CED had in the 1940s actually came to fruition. All of the last vestiges of those protective policies from the 1930s were eliminated in 1996. So that meant things like the grain reserve that actually served as a way to stabilize grain prices. It was completely eliminated. All of the policies that allowed the USDA to have a role in commodity markets and grain markets. The federal government's role in these markets was completely eliminated, and there was a lot of other deregulation that took place during the same period that had to do with the financial services industry that's led to a lot of speculation. The set-aside programs that meant that some marginal land would be kept out of production and would keep from having too many crops grown. All of this was eliminated in 1996. Now, the companies that lobbied for this were interested in having really cheap prices for things like corn and soy. So in 2 years, we began to see the dramatic effect of getting rid of these federal policies. By 1998, the price of corn had dropped by 50%, because when you have overproduction of a crop, and when there are none of these rules, it means that farmers have every incentive to make the most of their land and their equipment, because they know that the price is going to be very low. So we had massive overproduction of these commodity crops. So in 1998, the price of corn was 50% below what it had been in 96. The price of soy was 40% less. Now this began a complete restructuring of the meat industry. So in 1995, after the kind of the meat packers had begun to consolidate because of the changes in antitrust law, let's look at hogs as an example. So in the hog industry in 1995, 30% of hogs at that point were being raised on factory farms. And that was because of the beginning of this consolidation. Now, after cheap grain became available, this completely changed how contract hog growing can be done, because up until this time, farmers had a few hogs and they had to raise their own grain because it was too expensive to buy feed. But once this cheap feed was available, by 2007, it had made it possible for 95% of hogs to be grown on these Smithfield-type factory farms. And that was because of cheap grain. The soda industry saved about $1 billion the first few years because of cheap corn. But what began to happen to farmers because of these cheap prices and the overproduction? Well, they couldn't make a living, and we began to see even more farms lost. So in 1933, we had 6.8 farms, or million farms. Today we have under 1 million. So we have to think about who really benefited from cheap commodities. Now, we often hear that it's farmers because the federal government then began to subsidize farmers. So what happened is, as farms began to go out of business, there was a lot of political pressure, you can imagine, in rural areas. So in 1998, Congress, rather than reestablishing the grain reserve or putting some of these programs that had worked back into effect, they decided to help farmers survive by using taxpayer money in different programs. And so that's really the birth of the subsidy program that we hear so much about, which in my view is a symptom of a dysfunctional system. It's not really what's causing the dysfunctional system. We also have to look at who really benefits from these subsidies. Now, we often hear some of the environmental groups will say, well, it's only the largest farmers. Well, actually, that's not true, and that's because they use the USDA statistics, and the USDA dramatically exaggerates the number of farmers that exist today. They say that there are 2.2 million farmers left in the U.S., and they count anyone who has $10,000 in sales or less as a farmer. And in fact, anyone who makes less than $1,000 in sales as a farmer. So these are people like my friend who has a part-time flower business in the summer. These aren't real farmers. So when you exaggerate the number of farmers, that means, and then you look at how the subsidies work, it looks like only the largest farmers get subsidies. Actually, 82% of commodity farmers get some kind of subsidy from the federal government that actually benefits these large companies. And if you look at what a mid-sized farmer makes today in the United States, the average take-home income of a mid-sized farmer is $19.3 thousand, and half of that is from a government subsidy. So farmers are hardly getting rich from this, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about farm policy and about who really is benefiting. So I want to read a list of brands as we continue a discussion about who is actually benefiting from agriculture policy. And then I'm going to ask you why you think that I'm reading this list of brands. So Pepsi, Mountain Dew, Aquafina, Sierra Mist, Tazo, Sobe, Slice, Lipton Propel, Gatorade, Tropicana, Naked Juice, Captain Crunch, Aunt Jemima, Near East, Rice-A-Roni, Pasta-Roni, Puffed Wheat, Harvest Crunch, Quaker, Quisp, King Vitamin, Mother's Lay's, Maui Style, Ruffles, Doritos, Cheetos, Rolled Gold Sun Chips, Sabritones, Cracker Jacks, Chester's, Granules, Munchos, Smart Food, Baconettes, Matador, Hickory Sticks, Hostess Chips, Miss Vicky's, Munchies, True North. That's not the whole list, but that gives you a flavor. Now, why do you think I read that particular list of brands?
Corn is in there somewhere.
What? Corn?
Is in there somewhere?
Well, corn is definitely in there, but all of those brands are manufactured by the largest food company in the United States, PepsiCo. And I know that we're being generous in calling PepsiCo a food company because most of those items are not actually food. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up is when we look at who really lobbied for this change in policy and who really benefits from it, some of the biggest beneficiaries are the companies that own most of the brands in the grocery store. And you know, when you go into a grocery store, it looks like there's all of this competition and choice. You know, Americans love choice, we're told. Well, it turns out that we have 20 food manufacturers who own most of the brands that you see in the grocery store. 20 companies. And the top 5 are Pepsi, Nestle, Kraft, Tyson, the meat company, and the Brazilian meat company, JBS, that most people don't know the name, but does business in the U.S. under Swift and many other brands. And these companies have become very, very large because of all the mergers and acquisitions and the consolidation. And they've become so powerful that they are able to basically dictate food and farm policy in this country. Everything from what pesticides we're exposed to you know, whether genetically engineered foods are labeled or not. And these companies have figured out how to use a recipe of fat, sugar, and salt to basically addict people to junk food, literally, because eating these 3 ingredients together actually creates hormones in the brain that addicts people to food, literally. I mean, there's a lot of academic research on this. David Kessler, former Surgeon General, first wrote about it, but now there's actually a new book out about this. But it actually creates hormones that have much the same effect as other addictive substances, whether it's alcohol or drugs. And this is obviously making people both sick and is driving our obesity epidemic. Now, even though these companies are really powerful, they are not the most powerful food companies. The most powerful food companies these 20 companies actually have to listen to, and those are the grocery chains. We have 4 dominant grocery chains in this nation that overall control about 50% of sales, but in many, many markets control 70 to 90% of sales. The largest is Walmart. 1 out of 3 grocery dollars is spent at Walmart. And the Walmart heirs have as much wealth as the bottom 40% of Americans. That kind of says it, right there. The other 3 large chains are the Kroger brands and Costco and Target. So what's happened by having this very large consolidated grocery industry is that it's completely changed the market for how food is produced. And it's made it even difficult for the largest producers, even the junk food companies, to actually be profitable. Now, these grocery chains demand huge volume. Let's look at Walmart. They buy 1 billion pounds of beef every year. So, you know, Walmart really doesn't want to deal with a bunch of different meat packers. They really want to deal with, you know, a couple of very large meat packers. And so this has helped shape a marketplace where a lot of consolidation has had to take place to actually serve these very big chains. One of the things I did in writing Foodopoly is I went to the Central Valley of California because I really wanted to understand how fruits and vegetables actually make it to market, because we hear a lot of myths about it. And what I learned when I went there is that even though we think of California as kind of having the perfect place to be profitable in growing fruits and vegetables, it's very tough business there today. In part because 50% of fruits and vegetables actually now are grown outside of the United States. Even China is becoming a large provider of processed fruits and vegetables. I think they're the 3rd largest provider of processed fruits and vegetables in the U.S. today. So when you go and buy that organic edamame or corn, there's a good chance that if it's frozen, that it actually was grown in China. But anyway, so what happens to these large growers is that they can't make enough money to be in business anymore, and so they have also been consolidated. And in many cases, the largest shippers and packers have either purchased these farms. The largest shippers and packers often have tens of thousands of acres themselves. They have to have a contract or a business partner internationally where they can source the fruit or vegetable that they deal in. And then they have to be very heavily capitalized to be able to provide the volume to a store like Walmart. And because to sell to Walmart, you have to adhere to a lot of different requirements. You have to use their IT system, the packaging that they require, invest millions of dollars in radio frequency tags. You have to track your own inventory. Contracts with Walmart are non-negotiable. So this just gives you an idea of how difficult it is, even if you're a very large grower today, to actually do business in today's marketplace. And the same is true in the organics industry. So we see the same kind of consolidation with the largest natural food store, with Whole Foods has also consolidated buying its largest competitors. It has no national competitor today. And in fact, it sells more conventional food items than organic food items today, which is one of the reasons that it has just announced it's going to label genetically engineered food by 2018 because of all of the pressure it's been feeling for all of the conventional food that it sells there, because you know, people walk into Whole Foods and in the ambiance they somehow think that the conventional food items they're buying are actually better or have been screened, when really they're no different than what you get at the grocery store. And we also have the largest distributor of organic food in the country has now gone public, has no national competitors, and this is United Natural Foods, Inc., and is actually probably one of the parties most responsible for the high price of organic food, because it is constantly raising the price of organic food, refusing to serve many of Whole Foods' competitors if they're a local chain or a local natural food store, and they have stopped serving a lot of co-ops and buying clubs. So all of this has had a very chilling effect on organic food, and the largest organic brands, 14 of these food processing companies also are the owners of our largest organic brands. So I wrote Foodopoly really not just to be a bummer about our food system and to talk about how bad it is and that really we should just all give up and go to the beach. I really wrote Foodopoly to be kind of a call to action that we're going to need to do more than vote with our fork. We're going to need to vote with our vote, and then we're actually going to have to hold the people that we elect accountable. And in a lot of places, this probably is more easily done in local elections, and locally, all politics begin locally, right? And I know at Food and Water Watch, it's one of the reasons that we're so interested in state elections and why we have state offices and engage in state politics, is that we see for the long term, if we're really going to take back any federal policy, that we really need to start organizing at the state level, because every 10 years, state legislatures do the redistricting that really determines who goes to Congress. And if you live where I live in Virginia, I have a district that looks kind of like this, because we have a state legislature that's not representative of most people in our state, but that some very radical fringe people have been able to take over and elect people who are not representative of Americans. So I've been pretty excited to see in 30 states that there have been grassroots campaigns this year on food-related issues. In the case of genetic engineering, I think that the fact that that proposition in California to label genetically engineered food failed by just a couple of points because of the money that Monsanto and the processed food industry put up actually angered people, so that we've seen a lot of grassroots activity around the country. You know, not places that you necessarily expect to see it, places like New Mexico and Illinois and Michigan and Connecticut, where we saw legislation introduced on a food issue that really hadn't been dealt with in a long time. So I think I'll leave it there, and maybe we can have discussion. And
well, and luckily I know, I forgot to tell people we are going to quiz you on much of what Wenonah said. So those of you who did not take notes, you'll have to ask the doc here for a refresher, because we count on him to take notes, and I notice he and Glenn were noting down some things. But I think we have a pretty good view of 100 years of agricultural policy history. So they call Wenonah's organization Food and Water Watch, because they're obviously watching. They're watching. But I know there must be questions about all this good news she's bringing.